Welcome to While We Were Distracted, the podcast where we explore topics that often get overshadowed in the rush of daily life.
Welcome back, everybody, for another deep dive with us.
Glad to be back.
So today we're going to be going deep on conflict.
Yeah, a little deeper into the realities of conflict and how we perceive it and understand it.
And we've got some pretty fascinating source material for this one.
Yeah, this one's pretty wild.
We've got government documents, we've got historical analysis, and we've got some firsthand accounts.
And we're going to kind of try to weave together a narrative as much as we can from these disparate sources to see if we can get a better understanding of how conflict really operates.
Especially in the modern world.
Yeah, in the world that we live in today.
So to kick things off, why don't we start with Joseph Stiglitz and his book, The $3 Trillion War.
Yeah, so Stiglitz is an economist, and he won a Nobel Prize for his work.
So he knows what he's talking about.
Yeah, so he's no dummy. And in this book, he really breaks down the cost of war, and not just the financial cost, but also the human cost.
And this book is mostly focused on the Iraq War, right?
Yeah, primarily focused on the Iraq War and the kind of the aftermath of that.
And one of the things that really stood out to me was the point that he makes about the moral obligation that we have to the people that we collaborated with during these conflicts.
Yes, absolutely.
I mean, you're talking about people that put their lives on the line.
Interpreters and folks that were, assets in some way, shape, or form to the U.S. government. And yeah, there's a real question of what happens to these people after we pack up and leave.
I mean, they're facing real danger.
Yeah.
And it's not just a moral obligation, but it's a financial one as well.
Right.
I mean, these are debts that need to be paid.
Yeah, you can't just use people and then discard them.
Exactly. And this kind of leads us to the question of narrative, right?
Absolutely.
How much of what we know about these conflicts is actually true?
Well, that's what Michel Chossudovsky really digs into in his book, America's War on Terrorism.
This is a great book.
Yeah, so he really deconstructs the disinformation campaign that surrounded the Iraq War.
And I mean, the biggest one that comes to mind, of course, is the WMDs, the weapons of mass destruction.
Right. The whole justification for that war was based on this idea that Saddam Hussein had these weapons of mass destruction.
Which turned out to not be true.
Right. And Chossudovsky shows how this narrative was basically just a complete fabrication.
I remember back then, WMDs were everywhere on the news.
Absolutely. Yeah, it was constant.
It was like the phrase of the year or something.
It was, and it was very effective in getting the public on board with the war.
And the way that they linked Saddam Hussein with Al-Qaeda.
Right, creating this image of this axis of evil that we needed to go and fight against.
And that was just completely fabricated.
Yeah, there was no real evidence to support that.
It's terrifying how easily we can be manipulated by information.
It is, yeah, and it really makes you question everything you see and hear.
It really makes you wonder, who are the storytellers and what are their agendas?
Exactly, and that's where we get into the world of intelligence agencies.
Oh, yeah, this is where things get really interesting.
Both Chossudovsky and a lot of declassified CIA documents kind of point to the CIA's role in supporting the Mujahideen in Afghanistan back in the 80s.
And that's the group that would eventually become the Taliban?
Well, it's a little more complicated than that. But yeah, basically the CIA was arming and training these fighters to fight against the Soviets.
And then we ended up fighting against them.
Yeah, so it's this kind of bizarre situation where we essentially helped create the very enemy that we're now fighting.
Talk about unintended consequences.
Yeah, and when you add in the influence of Pakistan's intelligence agency, the ISI, it gets even more tangled.
It's like a spider web.
It is, yeah, very complex web of intrigue.
And then there's the issue of the drug trade in Afghanistan.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, this is something that really doesn't get talked about enough.
Despite the Taliban's initial prohibition on poppy cultivation, that trade really exploded under the U.S. military presence.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of hard to ignore the fact that the U.S. invaded Afghanistan, and then suddenly there's a huge boom in the heroin trade.
It does make you wonder what the true motives were behind the intervention.
Are we fighting wars for the reasons that we're being told? Or are there other forces at play?
Yeah, are we fighting wars for freedom and democracy, or are we fighting wars for profit and control?
And this is where the 9/11 Commission report comes into focus.
Yeah, so this report was supposed to be the definitive account of what happened on 9/11 and what led up to it.
But it actually leaves a lot of unanswered questions.
It does, yeah, and it acknowledges that there are inconsistencies in the official narrative, and it raises some questions about the CIA's knowledge of the impending attacks.
But it doesn't really provide any answers.
No, just kind of leaves you hanging.
And this lack of transparency just fuels speculation and distrust.
It does, yeah. It makes people wonder what's really going on.
What are they hiding from us?
Yeah, and it's further amplified when we examine the Pentagon's National Defense Strategy document.
This is a pretty chilling document,
It is, yeah. It outlines a vision of global military domination.
and it's shifted from targeting rogue states to targeting unstable nations.
Which is a much broader and more unsettling scope.
It's basically saying that we have the right to intervene in any country that we deem to be unstable.
And of course, this kind of strategy requires ever-increasing military expenditures.
Which is exactly what we've seen.
The U.S. has been pushing European nations to bolster their defense budgets as well.
And how is all of this justified to the public?
Well, that's where the phrase war on terror comes in.
Such a loaded phrase.
It is, yeah, and it's used to justify everything from austerity measures to the curtailing of civilian programs.
And of course, propaganda plays a massive role in shaping public opinion.
Absolutely.
I mean, fear is a powerful motivator.
And it's been very effectively exploited to maintain a state of perpetual anxiety.
This makes it much easier to justify these actions.
Right. If people are afraid, they're more likely to accept things that they wouldn't otherwise accept.
And sometimes the line between reality and carefully constructed narratives becomes dangerously blurred.
Yes, and that's where we see the example of these mock terror drills.
Like Atlantic Blue.
Right, these drills that are designed to simulate terrorist attacks.
And the similarities between these drills and actual terrorist attacks are pretty unsettling.
It makes you wonder if these attacks could have been orchestrated or at least known about in advance.
Are you saying that you think that they were?
I'm not saying that I know, but I'm saying that it's a question worth asking.
Charles Sadowski raises some serious questions about the potential for foreknowledge and the manipulation of events.
He does, yeah. And whether it's coincidence or something more sinister, the parallels are undeniable.
It's definitely something to think about.
It is.
So far we've been talking about modern conflicts,
Right.
but are there historical parallels that can shed some light on what we're seeing today?
Yeah, that's a good question.
I mean, are there any similarities between the Crusades and modern conflicts that are driven by religious ideology?
That's a very interesting question and one that I think we need to explore further.
Okay, so let's dive into that.
So the Crusades were a series of religious wars, that spanned centuries.
Yeah, like a really long time.
Yeah, I mean, we're talking like hundreds of years.
And they were all about reclaiming Jerusalem, right?
Well, that was the kind of stated goal, yeah, to reclaim Jerusalem and other holy sites from Muslim rule.
But you're saying there was more to it than that.
Oh, yeah, much more. I mean, for European rulers, the Crusades offered a way to expand their territories, gain access to lucrative trade routes.
So it's kind of like an economic opportunity as well.
Absolutely. I mean,
Yeah.
It was a chance to kind of consolidate their power, and the church saw it as an opportunity to assert their authority.
So the church was involved in this as well.
Oh, yeah, big time. I mean, they were promising indulgences and forgiveness of sins to those who fought in the Holy Land.
Wow. So you had this mix of religious fervor, political ambition, and economic incentives.
Yeah, it was a potent cocktail.
It makes you wonder if similar forces are at work in today's world.
It does, doesn't it? I mean, are modern conflicts like the war on terror just a new form of crusade?
A clash of civilization.
Yeah, that's a narrative that's often pushed by certain groups.
But you're saying it's not that simple.
No, the world is a much more complex place than it was during the Crusades. I mean, we live in a globalized society. We're interconnected in ways that were unimaginable back then.
So you're saying that religion isn't the main driver of conflict anymore?
I'm saying that it's rarely the sole motivator.
Okay, but there's still a lot of rhetoric out there about a holy war, a clash between Islam and the West.
There is, and that rhetoric is dangerous. It's used to recruit followers, justify violence, and demonize the other side.
So how do we make sense of that?
I think we need to look beyond the rhetoric and examine the deeper motivations. Who benefits from this narrative of a clash of civilizations?
Who profits from perpetuating fear and division?
Yeah, those are the questions we need to be asking.
So it's not really about religion then?
Well, it's not that simple. I mean, there are undoubtedly tensions, differences in values, historical grievances that contribute to conflict.
But framing it as a monolithic clash between two civilizations is too simplistic.
It is, and it's dangerous because it prevents us from seeing the nuances, the complexities, the human stories that lie at the heart of these conflicts.
Okay, so if it's not a crusade, then what is it?
Well, that's a complex question, and there's no easy answer.
But there are some key factors, right?
Yeah, we can identify some of the main drivers of conflict.
Why what?
Well, competition for resources is a big one.
Yeah, like oil and water.
Exactly. Those are often sources of conflict, and then there's political instability.
How does that play into it?
Well, when a country is unstable, weak, or corrupt, it becomes vulnerable to exploitation.
So other countries take advantage?
Yeah, outside powers might intervene either directly or through proxies.
To further their own interests.
Right, and this can create a breeding ground for resentment, anger, and extremism.
And that's where extremist ideologies come in.
Exactly. They exploit the chaos and resentment to recruit followers and gain power.
And then you have this cycle of violence that's really hard to break.
Yeah, and let's not forget the role of globalization in all of this.
What do you mean?
I mean, the interconnectedness of the world economy means that events in one region can have ripple effects across the globe.
So a conflict in one part of the world can destabilize entire regions.
Absolutely, leading to economic hardship, displacement, and further conflict.
It's a mess.
It's a very tangled web.
So it's not just about religious differences or cultural clashes.
No, it's about a complex interplay of political, economic, and social factors that contribute to conflict.
It's about power greed and the manipulation of fear and anger.
It's about those who seek to profit from division and chaos.
And often at the expense of human lives.
Sadly, yes.
So how do we break this cycle?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
I mean, it could feel pretty overwhelming at times.
It can, but I think understanding the true nature of these conflicts is a crucial first step.
So we need to understand the motivations, the players, the historical context.
Exactly. Knowledge is power.
And we need to be critical thinkers.
Yes. We need to question the narratives we're given, look beyond the headlines, and seek out diverse perspectives.
We can't just blindly accept what we're being told.
No, we need to think for ourselves, and we need to be wary of those who benefit from perpetuating fear and division.
And what about the role of individuals?
Well, that's another great question. Well, I think it starts with empathy.
Empathy. Okay, but how do we cultivate empathy in a world that seems so divided?
It's tough, but it's about trying to understand the perspectives of those who are different from us.
Yeah.
People who hold different beliefs, different backgrounds, who, may have experienced the world in a totally different way.
It's not easy though, right?
No.
I mean, we're constantly being bombarded with these messages of fear and hate.
Right.
Messages that encourage us to see others as enemies instead of fellow human beings.
Yeah. Yeah, you're absolutely right. It takes a conscious effort to resist those messages,
Oh,
to look beyond the stereotypes and the prejudices that divide us.
Yeah.
But I think it's an effort worth making.
Okay, so where do we even begin? How do we find that common ground, that shared humanity that can bridge these divides?
I think we can start by listening to each other's stories,
Okay.
recognizing that behind every conflict, every act of violence, there are human beings with hopes and dreams, fears and vulnerabilities.
Yeah, you remind me of something that Stiglitz wrote about the moral obligation that we have to those that collaborated with the U.S. during the Iraq War.
Yes.
These are people that put their lives at risk. They trusted us, and now they're facing the consequences of that trust.
Exactly. Their stories are a powerful reminder that conflicts are never just about, abstract ideologies or geopolitical chess moves.
Yeah.
They're about real people, real lives, real consequences.
So listening to those stories, that's a starting point. But what else can we do? How do we move beyond empathy to, action?
We can support organizations that are working to alleviate suffering, to provide humanitarian aid to promote dialogue and reconciliation.
Okay.
There are countless individuals and groups doing really incredible work on the ground, in conflict zones all over the world.
Yeah, I've seen firsthand the impact that even small grassroots organizations can have.
Yeah.
Providing food, shelter, medical care, education.
Yeah, they're literally saving lives and rebuilding communities.
Yeah.
And we can support them through donations, volunteering our time, or just, spreading awareness about their work. Every little bit helps.
And what about the role of information? We've talked a lot about how propaganda and disinformation can really fuel conflict. So how do we combat that?
I think we need to be critical thinkers. We need to question the information that we're given, to look for evidence, to consider multiple perspectives.
Yeah.
We can't just passively consume what we see in the headlines or on social media.
It's about being discerning consumers of information.
Exactly.
Recognizing that there's often more to the story than what's being presented.
Absolutely. And we need to be active citizens, engaged in our communities, advocating for policies that promote peace and justice.
Yeah.
We can't just sit back and hope that someone else will fix these problems.
I get that, but it can feel really daunting at times.
I understand.
This responsibility to be informed, to be engaged, to make a difference in a world that often feels so chaotic and overwhelming.
I understand that feeling, but remember, even small actions can have a ripple effect. A kind word to a stranger, a donation to a worthy cause, a conversation with someone who holds different views. These are all seeds of peace that we can plant in the world.
So as we wrap up this deep dive,
Mm.
what's the one thing you hope our listeners will take away from this conversation?
I hope they'll come away with a sense of both urgency and possibility.
Okay.
The challenges we face are real, and the stakes are high, but I believe peace is possible. It starts with each of us in our own hearts and minds. It starts with choosing empathy over fear, understanding over judgment, and action over apathy.
That's a great message to end on. Thank you for joining us on this journey into the heart of conflict. We hope it's challenged your thinking and inspired you to action. Remember, the world is what we make it. Let's choose to make it a world of peace.
We hope you enjoyed this episode of While We Were Distracted. We will continue our dive into documents and books found in the Bin Laden compound that have been released by CIA. To see the full dump, check the description and comments or visit the CIA library at cia.gov. Don't forget to like and subscribe for the next episode on While We Were Distracted.